For centuries, the world has depended on trade. Ships crossing oceans, caravans moving through deserts, goods flowing quietly from one place to another. Most of the time, this system feels permanent, reliable, almost invisible. But there was a year when global trade nearly stopped. No world war, no global pandemic, no single explosion or headline moment. Just a slow breakdown that exposed how fragile the entire system really was. This is the story of the year the world almost stopped trading. It began as a normal period of growth. Ports were busy, markets were stable, nations depended on one another more than ever before. By the early 20th century, global trade had become tightly connected. Raw materials moved from colonies to factories. Finished goods moved from factories to consumers. Food crossed borders daily. Most countries no longer produced everything they needed. They relied on ships arriving on time. They relied on credit, trust, and cooperation. Few people questioned whether this system could fail. Then, quietly, pressure began to build. The problem was not one single event. It was a series of small decisions, taken separately, that slowly collided. At the center of the issue was money. International trade depended heavily on credit. Merchants rarely paid in cash. They used promises, loans, and delayed payments. Banks made this possible. They financed shipments months before goods arrived. They trusted that buyers would pay later. As long as confidence remained strong, the system worked. But confidence is fragile. In the years leading up to the crisis, many countries made the same choice. They borrowed heavily. They expanded production. They assumed trade would continue to grow forever. It did not. When markets slowed, governments became nervous. They worried about gold reserves. They worried about debt. They worried about appearing weak. Instead of coordinating, they turned inward. One country tightened credit. Another raised tariffs. Another restricted currency exchange. Each decision made sense on its own. Together, they created a chain reaction. Banks became cautious. Loans disappeared. Merchants could no longer finance shipments. Ships sat idle in harbors, not because there was nothing to trade, but because no one could pay to move goods. Trade routes that had operated for generations suddenly stalled. Farmers felt it first. Crops were ready, but buyers vanished. Prices collapsed. Food rotted while cities experienced shortages. Factories followed. Raw materials stopped arriving. Workers were laid off. Production slowed, then stopped entirely. What made this collapse dangerous was its silence. There were no battles, no declarations, no clear enemy, just empty docks, quiet warehouses, unpaid workers. Governments responded in ways that made the situation worse. They raised tariffs to protect local industries. They banned imports to save foreign currency. They restricted exports to preserve domestic supplies. Each action reduced trade even further. Instead of rebuilding trust, nations competed defensively. The global system began to fracture. Countries that depended heavily on exports suffered the most. Their economies had been built on selling goods abroad. Without buyers, they collapsed rapidly. Shipping companies went bankrupt. Banks failed. Insurance markets froze. Trade volumes fell at a speed never seen before. In some regions, international trade dropped by more than half. The world had not stopped trading completely, but it came dangerously close. The real danger was not scarcity. The world still had resources. It still had labor. What it lacked was coordination. Every country acted alone. And that was the lesson history would later remember. As the crisis deepened, the social consequences became impossible to ignore. Unemployment soared. Poverty spread. Political extremism found fertile ground. When people lose work and stability, they look for answers. They look for blame. Trade, once seen as progress, became a target. Foreign goods were portrayed as threats. International cooperation was framed as weakness. This shift would shape global politics for decades. Eventually, slowly, the system began to recover. Not because markets fixed themselves, but because leaders learned a hard truth. Trade cannot survive without trust, and trust cannot exist without cooperation. New agreements were formed, rules were standardized, institutions were created to prevent the same collapse from happening again. Banking systems were regulated, currencies were stabilized, communication between nations improved. The world did not return to the old system. It built a new one designed to absorb shocks, one that understood interdependence. But the memory faded. As decades passed, trade once again became invisible. Ships returned to the seas. Containers moved quietly across borders. People assumed the system was permanent. History, however, rarely repeats itself exactly. It rhymes. The lesson of that year remains relevant. Global trade is not just about goods. It is about trust. It is about shared responsibility. When nations forget that, the system weakens. The year the world almost stopped trading was not defined by a single disaster. It was defined by silence, by hesitation, by the failure to act together. And that is why it matters. Because the most dangerous collapses do not announce themselves. They unfold quietly, while everyone assumes someone else is in control. History does not warn loudly. It waits to see who is paying attention.